Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John, and today we have a game between two titans of modern chess, world champion Magnus Carlsen and the young phenom Alireza Firouzja. Magnus Carlsen has white, Firouzja has black. This is played at the Super United Blitz 2022 in Zagreb, 5 minutes each side, 2-second increment. Let's jump right in. Magnus begins with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3. And Firouzja plays a move he's played before. He goes ahead and takes the pawn at c4, and after e4, b5. And the next sequence of moves look odd, but they're very common in this position. Knight takes b5, but now black can take the pawn at e4. Queen to a4, threatening a discovered check with the knight. Knight at d7 blocks that check, and then the queen takes the pawn at c4. And here bishop to d6 is played, and after knight takes d6, knight takes d6, we can assess the position. Obviously, Firouzja is hitting Carlsen's queen at the moment, but Carlsen has the two bishops. That's essentially his advantage, but black has well-placed pieces as well. The queen moves out of the attack to c2 and bishop to b7. One of the advantages of black's position is that Firouzja has control of that long, dark squared, light squared, diagonal. Bishop g5, Magnus hits Firouzja's queen. The queen goes to c8, and Magnus plays rook to c1, piling up on that backward pawn, that weakness, at c7. And Firouzja plays knight to f5. He counterattacks the pawn at d4, threatening moves like bishop takes knight, followed by knight takes d4, and queen takes c7. Now, in this position, Firouzja's best choice appears to have been castling, and then let white take on c8 if he wants to. But in the game, he played queen c7, rook c7, and this helps Magnus a bit because now he's got this rook on the 7th rank, where he wouldn't have had it before. Bishop takes knight, removing the defender of d4 and ruining white's kingside pawn structure. Pawn takes bishop and knight to d4. So Firouzja already has a threat. Knight to f3 check, which would fork the king and the bishop. And here we have two knights against two bishops in an open position. And when you have the two knights, you need to make them as active as you possibly can. Otherwise, white will get comfortable and use those two bishops to sort of dominate your position. So Alireza starts using his knights as intensely as he possibly can. After bishop to e3, he plays knight to e5, not worrying about the knight at d4. If that knight is taken, then knight to f3 check forks the king and the bishop. Your knights have to be tricky in these positions. After bishop to g2, rook to d8 was played. Castling sort of consolidates the position a bit, and that was the best choice as it turns out. But rook to a7 is the most obvious choice, clearly, in the position. And now Magnus has two passed pawns on the queen side, and those are going to be very, very dangerous. The knight comes into d3 with check. So we see Alireza is doing everything he can to get his knights as active as possible. The king moves, and now knight to f4. After bishop f4, Alireza would play knight to b5 with a discovered check and attacking Magnus Carlsen's rook at a7. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification button for further videos. So instead, Magnus takes on d4 instead to avoid that tactic. And here, rook takes d4 was the best move from Alireza, taking that with check. But instead, he plays e5, which is a move that makes sense. I mean, the bishop is pinned, and we all know the phrase, pin it and win it. So it's pinned, and now black wants to win it. But it turns out, after bishop to f1, white's doing pretty well. And even after king to c2, e4, rook to e1 check, white's getting very active. So after bishop to f1, rook takes d4, king c2, and now white's queenside pawns are growing very powerful in this position. And the bishop, which was trapped on g2, now has a nice flexible diagonal available to it. Castles, rook to c7 to keep black from checking on c8 because we got the rook down here on c2. Knight to e6 hits the rook. Rook comes back to c4, offering the trade. Firouzja says no way. Rook to c3, rook f to d8, bishop to c4, and Firouzja plays rook to d2 check. The king goes to b1, and now knight to d4. And we can see Firouzja is putting a lot of tactical pressure on Magnus's position. His pieces are well posted and active. Rook to f1 defends f2, and now rook to b8, threatening to take on b2 with check. Magnus Carlsen's king is under some pressure. b3 is really forced. g5 was played. Firouzja begins to mobilize his own kingside majority. h3, and here he could have just gone ahead and traded rooks. That would have helped simplify things for white. He delays that after h3, king g7, and now Carlsen plays rook to d3, takes, bishop takes, knight takes f3. So now the position is equal, same number of pawns. Black is threatening knight to d2, which would fork the king and the rook, but white is better. And the reason Magnus is better in this position is because he has a better minor piece, the bishop versus knight with pawns on both sides of the board, and also his pawns at a2 and b3 are really healthy and are going to be very hard to stop from queening. So king to b2 is what Magnus played. Now e4, continuing the tactics. If the bishop takes on e4, then knight to d2, hits the rook and the bishop. When the rook defends it, then rook to e8. Now you've got a pin that's a real problem. After f3 to support the bishop, then f5, and black would be winning. So instead, Carlsen plays bishop to e2. f5 was played. It turns out the computers like knight to e5, keeping the knights on the board, keeping that knight active. Firouzja plays f5, advancing the majority. Rook to d1. Magnus, it also says that Magnus should have played bishop takes f3 here, and his pawns should be faster than black's weakened pawns on the king side. But he played rook to d1, h5, the pawns begin to march. Rook to d5, attacking f5, king to f6, defending. Now the pawns are moving, a4 and h4. Obviously, black wants to play g4 and then advance the h-pawn to the queening square. a5, g4, pawn takes, and we see our two key racing pawns on the a file and the h file. a6, the pawn keeps going, h3, bishop to f1, and here Firouzja plays knight to g5. A stronger idea, as it turns out, was knight to e1, because what white wants to do is when this pawn moves to h2, he wants to be able to move the bishop here to stop it. But a knight on e1 controls this square. So knight to e1, as it turns out, was a little bit stronger. Firouzja plays the knight to g5, king to c3, coming forward. And now e3, a strong idea from Alireza. He wants to distract the f-pawn away so that these two pawns on the king side cannot be slowed down by a pawn. They're free to roam. fe3 and g3, just like this. These two pawns are quite strong. Rook to d4. Carlsen wants to move behind these passed pawns to stop them. King to f5 to control the g4 square so the rook cannot move there. Rook to f4 check, king to e5. And in this position, Carlsen should have gone ahead and played rook to g4. That would have been the strongest idea. Knight e4, king b2, g2. And here, after giving up his bishop for the two pawns, this is a drawn position, the rook versus rook and knight. But he's got the three pawns, and this would have been a draw. But instead, Carlsen plays bishop takes h3. And now, because of a little tactic, Firouzja is able to keep his g3 pawn. First, he takes the bishop. Now, rook to g4 to stop the pawn, but then knight to f2. And he cannot take on g3 because of knight to e4 check. And that trick keeps that pawn. He plays rook to g7, but after this move, king to f6, look, every single square on the file is controlled. There's nowhere for white's rook to go. And if he moves to another file, then boom, g2, and he cannot stop the pawn from advancing. So essentially, he's forced to take the pawn and walk into the fork. Rook g3, knight e4 check, king c4, knight g3. And now Magnus hopes that his three pawns will help save his position. b4, knight e4, king d5, rook takes b4, and of course grabbing a pawn, but also defending the knight at e4. King c6, rook a4, rook behind the passed pawn, king to b6, and knight to d6. And in this position, at the end of this blitz game, Magnus Carlsen resigned because of a7, knight to c8 check, winning that pawn and the game. Now, even after this great game from Alireza Firouzja, defeating the world champion, there is still some great chess that you are missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you want to see is this video right here. So make sure to watch that next video to see some really mind-blowing chess.